Hey guys, it's Robin, RsIslandCrafts. Welcome to my craft room. Now that we've made a bunch of our string blocks, now we can start putting them together into a quilt. We've sewn all our strips down onto our foundation, whether it's fabric or some form of paper. For those of us that used paper, we've removed it. And as you can see, mine still has a few little pieces in there. I am not going to be worried about that. That's going to come out in the wash. It'll disintegrate eventually, or it'll just stay part of my quilts. I was thinking about the different things that we can do with these. Now, there are loads of things. So if you head over to Pinterest and just search string blocks, string block quilts, string block projects, any form of string block, Pinterest is really good. If you just search for string quilt blocks, they're going to show you all the tutorials, they're going to show you the quilts, and there's always search more like this or find more like this. And you can spend hours and hours and maybe a few more hours just wandering around Pinterest looking at all the different things. I try to stay away from there unless I'm looking for something specific, or I know I have 15 or 20 minutes to kill and I didn't bring any knitting projects with me. Sometimes it's fun to just wander around Pinterest, but I have to be careful because if I only have a small chunk of time, I can blow that whole amount of crafting time wandering around Pinterest and finding all kinds of new projects that I want to make. But this isn't a Pinterest show, so let's get to the sewing part. I was thinking that I want to make a baby quilt with my string blocks. Now, I can make one baby quilt for each type of project I want to show you today, or I can just go ahead and make like a sampler. So I thought, well, let me go ahead and put together a string block sampler quilt and see after it's put together if it's kind of scary looking, that I make something ugly, or if it's going to turn into something fun. I also need to add an extra row onto this baby quilt that I've shown you in previous Talk to Me Tuesday episodes. That's kind of what got this whole thing going, so we can all see how these blocks go together. Several of you wanted to learn how to make these half square triangle blocks. Now I am going to show you that today, and I'm going to put them, I'll make it out of this fabric and I'll put it onto this quilt, but I'm also going to make a separate quilt today with a couple different variations. Now, I haven't completely put the quilt together yet because I want to show you some of the stuff, but some of the things were so simple you do not need me to show you how to sew them together. So I'm having 6 sections because I'm making it about 36 by 36, and that these are 6.5-inch blocks. This way you can see how different ways they go together. Not all of us have like EQ8 or some type of software where we can plug in our blocks that we've made and move them all around to see what they're going to look like before we make a quilt. Now, of course, these are going to be different because we all have different scraps, but you'll kind of get an idea, and if you'll see one of these layouts that you like, then you can go ahead and keep making your blocks and going towards that. You can do this with any size blocks you have. I tend to I like 6.5-inch blocks. It's a nice size for me. That's what I tend to go with. I didn't need the long strips when I was stitching on my fabric onto my foundations. And even when I'm making regular quilts, I either do a 6.5 or a 12.5. So they kind of work together for me. You can, of course, make any size you want. I did my first row. I just went ahead and I just stitched them all together. So there's no sashings, nothing to separate in between. I didn't do anything in this one and I kept them all going at the same way. So I have my small part in the upper right corner and the bottom left. Of course, you can switch it any way you want. This will be one of my rows in my string block quilt sampler. Simple. You can put them all together like this. You'll have, if you use like the same fabrics all the way, like you have a whole section of blues, you can make them in rows or columns, or if you just go totally scrappy, you'll just have a whole bunch of a wild and crazy scrappy quilt together. Then I decided to do a row where I alternated them. Now, they're not all going in the same direction. They're not all the same like this one. Here's our first example. And then I went ahead and I did this. And see how these were all going the same way, and these I went and zigzagged. I also went and used the ones that had the black centers to them, so that my row would go ahead and have this fun little accent strip going through the center. Now, of course, you would have to plan that ahead of time if you wanted to do a whole quilt like this. And as I showed previously, you can have them going like this so that you would have a diamond, or you can have them going like this so that you would have an X. So you can put your accent strips in any direction you like. So now that's what you can do with them if you only use your string blocks and you use nothing else. You could alternate them like this if you wanted to. I think you'd probably be better off if you either left them all going in the same direction or alternated them, because at this point you already got a lot going on with all the variety of scraps you're using, that it might be better to go ahead and make sure that if you're doing it this way, to do it one way or the other. Now, if you got tired of making strings and you only made enough to do maybe half a quilt and you gave up because it really wasn't something you enjoyed, you can go ahead and put a solid block of the same size in between. Once again, I kept all of my string blocks going in the same direction. And I just added this cute little flowery fabric in between. You can use a straight white, you can use a black or any color. You can use a variety of colors in this. If you use a 5 or 6 or the whole rainbow, you can have a nice variety, and then it would actually match all your different blocks. But I thought that would help calm down the blocks. And of course, when I put it, if you were to do a whole quilt like this, you would go ahead and alternate it, because right here you would put your solid block and then you would put a string. So it's more like a checkerboard. And I thought that would help calm down the blocks. Or as I said, if you made a few and you decided you've made enough, or you don't have enough scraps to make any more, you can go ahead and stop right there and just go ahead and add these in there. Now, I kept using the same contrast fabric so it would kind of coordinate a little bit in this quilt, but you can use different stuff. I just happen to have just enough to work on this quilt with a little bit left over. And on this row, I went ahead and made half square triangles out of them. And once again, as you see, they're all going in the same direction. All of my strings are at the bottom left, and I have all of my fabric, my contrast up here. Solid fabric, all the same, a variety of different ones. And that's what that row would look like if you just did half square triangles and they all went in the same direction. You can go ahead and line them up so that each row is identical. I will probably be making a baby quilt like this because this is stunning. I've made so many of these baby quilts so far, and I got so many done in this short amount of time. I don't remember. I don't think I've made one completely just like this with the same fabric and a half square triangle all lined up. But if I haven't made one of those, I think that'll be my next week's quilt. And the other one that I plan on adding into this little sampler is I thought I'd go ahead and make some pinwheels. Now these will take up 2 rows in my quilt because, you know, you need to have 2 rows. You have to have 4 blocks to make a pinwheel. And that's just alternating. It's still half square triangles, and that's just having them spin and alternating them as they go around. And I made 2 of those blocks. And I thought those were really nice, but I wanted to do, it's going to use 3 of these to go across the row, but I wanted to do one more thing to show you. Well, technically it's 2. I have not sewn these completely together, but I thought some flying geese would be fun too. So you can stitch these together, and I will put a pinwheel block on each side of it and let this be the center. And if you didn't want to do the flying geese, if you just go ahead and alternate this block this way, you would have a center square here. So when you sew it together this way, you will have your main contrast fabric here. If you were to make an entire quilt of these, as you would put them together, you would have your string blocks together and they would make a secondary design. Or if you stitch this together in the opposite way, where you put these little wings into the center of your goose here, and you put your square together, you would have all of these, and then these would be on the outside. So if you only wanted one block, you have to decide if you want to have your contrast fabric in the center, and if you want it to be all the same, or if you'd prefer to leave your strings in the center. I only made one of these, so I can't show you the opposite. But once you go ahead, if you'd made a whole entire quilt like this, which one again, if I have enough string blocks, I might go ahead and make one like this also. But I decided that I wanted to have the flying geese in mine. So I will have it that way, and I will have the pinwheels on either side. Now, since all of these are going to be using the half square triangles, I thought today I just showed you what I'm going to put together into my quilt, but then I'm going to show you actually how to make the half square triangles so that you can kind of play around and decide how you want to put your strings together and if you want to use half square triangles at all. So I'm going to go ahead and sew these into a baby quilt, and if you want to see what they look like, go ahead and go back to my Talk to Me Tuesday or my Whip It Wednesday a couple days ago of this week, and you'll see what it looks like in a full-size quilt. But like I said, I'm going to show you the ones with the black and the string blocks, and that's what we're going to do our half square triangles with. Some of you may remember this baby quilt that I made a few weeks ago. I decided it ended up being something like 31 by 36 or some weird odd number like that, and I wanted to make it more 36 by 36 and enlarge it just a little bit so that it was wide enough, because as it is, 36 is already a small enough baby quilt. And I don't like to go too much narrower, even though it will work in a stroller or whatever, but this way it matches all the rest of my quilts, and then we can be all matchy-matchy. So I need to put one more column or one more row, depending on how I turn the blanket, of these half square triangles. So that's what we're going to work on today. I'm going to show you how I made these and walk you through the process of making them. I have a couple left over that it never made it into the blanket, so I will be using these. And one of the things we need to think about when we're doing these half square triangles, we've already made our string blocks, so we're pretty well set at a size. But when you make half square triangles, and we're going to do it in the method where we draw a line down the center and we stitch on both sides of it, we cut up the center, and then we end up with two half square triangles blocks. Since these are already made, these are 6.5 inches. When we finish these, after we take them out, cut them apart, sew them, and trim them down and everything, we're going to end up with blocks that are 5.5 inches. So your basic math is whatever size finished half square triangle you need, your original pieces of fabric, or in this case a block, needs to be an inch larger. So if you wanted them to finish in your quilt at 5 inches, that would mean this block right here is 5.5 inches because of our seam allowance. I know it always sounds so complicated when we first start doing these things as a new quilter, but once you start making them, these numbers are just going to roll right off your tongue also, and when you hear them, it's not going to sound like gibberish or a foreign language. We just need to know that anytime we sew our fabric together into a quilt, we're going to lose a 1/4 inch seam allowance on both sides. So that's why we end up losing all the way around. We lose that 1/2 inch. So this started at 5.5. I sew it into my quilt, it'll be 5 inches. As you see, each of these blocks are 5 inches. Since I already have my string blocks ready, I've already made them and I've removed the paper and everything. These are 6.5 inches. I went ahead and I cut my contrasting fabric 6.5 inches to make the block. If you were making 9.5 or 12.5 inch string blocks, then you would cut that fabric exactly the same to match that block. There's a few different ways you can make half square triangles, but I'm just going to stick with the simple. The one that I learned the very first time is you just put your fabrics together. And as I said, we're going to sew down on either side of the central line, cut it in the middle, and then we'll have our two blocks. So for every 6.5 inch block that I have here, I'm going to get 2 half square triangles. Now there's a couple different ways that we could still do this. I have a ruler and I have a variety of marking pens, and what we can do is we can just line up our ruler from corner to corner and then just draw a line straight down the center. And then when we take it to our sewing machine, as you see my line straight down the center, you would just go ahead and sew a 1/4 inch on one side, then you would spin it around and sew a 1/4 inch on the other side of that line. Now you can do that. I do put my center mark down there sometimes, but then after a while I started figuring out sometimes it's hard with your sewing machine to get exactly a 1/4 inch on either side of this line. So I found that it was easier just to mark those 2 sewing lines versus the line down the center. And that way I know every single block I make is going to be at least stitched the same way, and that's going to make all of my blocks become to the same size and match more easily. So I have this ruler, I don't remember what it's called, but it's from On the Grid, and I believe it's just called a half-inch ruler. I think that might be all that it's called. I purchased mine on Amazon. If I can find it again, I will go ahead and link it down below. But mine came in a 3-pack. I know there's only 2 here, but the third one I use when I make my hand sewing blocks so that I can go ahead and use that to mark my 1/4-inch seam line. So it came with a long one. This one is 12 inches. This one is 4, and the other one is either 6 or 9. I've been doing mine right here on the black fabric. My options for marking on the black fabric, since my blue pen is not going to work, a mechanical pencil won't show up on the black. You can get one of these. This is labeled a dressmaker, but it's also have ones that are called quilting pencils. They have white and they have yellow and they have gray. You could use a colored pencil, a white or yellow colored pencil to mark on it. They also have, this is a Fons and Porter. It is full of chalk and it has this little metal wheel on it, so when you draw on fabric it leaves a chalk line, and mostly it does stay there, but you could end up brushing it away as you're doing your sewing or moving it from spot to spot. I like to use this when I'm cutting out certain things and I am working on black, or if I'm going to go ahead and maybe I'm working on a quilting design, I might want to use that. Recently, I pulled out of my stash of pens. This is an ornament ball marker that I picked up at the Dollar Tree. This is from Crafter's Square. I'm not sure if it's their brand, but they always have a lot of Crafter Square products there. And this is to write on an ornament ball, those plastic or glass ornament balls you can buy. But it's white. I was testing it out one time and I thought, well, it's a white marker, a white pen. Let me go ahead and give that a try. I believe other pen manufacturers also have a white that you can test out. Now, as you can see, it has a pretty thick tip on it, so I definitely want to make sure that I'm going sideways and not straight up and down. But I lined up my yellow line so that it goes onto my 2 points, and it's right there on my corners. And then I just took my marker and I drew down one side. You can reach over and go right-handed, or you can just practice a little ambidextrous. This is kind of good to get your brain and your body working in a different way. And then I have my white marks on either side. I did test this out, and it did line up with my 1/4 inch. I was measuring with this one right here, and I was using my presser foot and my needle and everything to line up a 1/4 inch off of here, and I was able to line it right up. So my little white marks, there are actually 3 of them, a little bit underneath that thread you can possibly see. So it was pretty accurate as long as I kept my pen on the side. So then I took then I grabbed my string block and I put it so that I had my long piece going left and right, and I had my corner pieces that I stitched on pretty much at the top and bottom here. Because when I stitch it on, I want to make sure that the corners that I'm going through, so when I cut it in half, that I have my blocks going this way. Now you can put it this way if you would like. You're just going to get a different look so that when you stitch it, all of your blocks are going to be going this way. Where on this one, I have them all going diagonal. I got more. Let me see. Did I get more? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So I've got 3.5 strips of fabric this way, and I got 7 strips this way. I like the way it looks this way. It gives it a little bit better contrast and a little bit more movement to the quilt and stuff. Because this way I could just cut it in half. I could just cut it from corner to corner with my rotary cutter. Zip. Cut triangles here, zip, stitch them together, and I would get the same thing. But I like the contrast going the other way. So I would take this to my sewing machine. If you would like, you can add a couple pins. I would pin out in these triangle areas so it's out of the way for when you're sewing. And that would hold it all together nice and neat for you so nothing would move. And then I would just keep stacking these on top of each other. I would keep making them. I would go ahead and make as many as I could sew today, or I might just go ahead and pin them all together ahead of time and then come back and sew the next day. And when I take them to my sewing machine, I'm going to stitch along this line, and I'm going to let that one hang off the edge of the machine. And then I'm just going to go ahead and follow it through with the next one, and I'm going to keep stitching along, and I'm just let it keep going through. And I would do that with all of my blocks until I got to the end. And when I got to my last one, I would take all of my blocks, spin them around, and this way I can keep continuously chain piecing them, and I don't have to actually stop to snip them apart or anything. When I got to the last one, I would just pull it out of my machine just a little bit to let the thread, just a little bit, an inch or two, and then when I spin it around, I'll be able to start sewing here. You can see that I did it. This is where I cut my thread after I went around that corner. And then I would stitch down the opposite side. And then once again, I would just keep chain piecing them and keep feeding them through until I was done. Then after they come out of the machine, I just take my scissors and I'd snip in between the two of them and I'd be all set. Now after I had them all stitched, I take them over to my pressing station and I go ahead and set the seams. Do you know how after we run any of our blocks through the sewing machine, we go ahead and press the threads down to make sure it settles into the fabric so that they're not sticking up a little bit, so when you fold it back, even one little thread can put you off. So you want to make sure that you go ahead and set your seams. I'd press them all to make sure they're all nice and neat. Once again, I'd stack them all up on the side of my cutting table when I was done. My next step would be to take them. You could go ahead and just cut these with your scissors if you want. If you have the line already on there, you can follow on the line. But if you don't have that line available, because we only drew down the two sides, I just take a larger ruler than what my block is. My block is 6.5, so I grabbed my 9.5 inch ruler. Since it's a 9.5 inch ruler, I have this is the little half part here, so I have the 1/4 inch marked on either side. So what I like to do is I like to use this 1/4 inch mark here, but you can use any of the ones that you have along the side of your ruler. I just like this one because it has, at this little last edge, there's not a lot of printing on it. When we're over on this side, we have all these different little markers here so we know where we're at. This way I don't have to look through a lot. I line my 1/4 inch up on either one of these lines. You know, the one over on the left. I could flip my square either way, it wouldn't matter. Then once I have it lined up, just go ahead and hold down on my ruler and I slice through. A little bit of pressure because we're going through a lot of this different seam allowances there. I cut all of mine up. I make 2 stacks like this, or I can just always flip one like this. If I'm cutting a bunch of these, 10 or 20 of them, it's just as easy to go like this. And then every time I just keep stacking them up. And then when I have my 2 piles, then I can flip them together. It's less movements on your hands and your wrists. Because if you're doing this 100 times, you can go ahead and get that repetitive strain issue on it at all. So it's always nice to be kind to your wrists and your hands and not do as many movements if you don't have to. I stack them all up, then I put the 2 stacks together, and I take them over to my pressing station. I find, since I'm using black, it's easy for me just to press to this side. If you're using white, you might want to make a different decision. But since I have all of these different seams here, I find it easier to just go ahead and press over to the single solid fabric versus trying to press all of these, having to press all of these this way. My block naturally wants to lay this way, so I'm going to go ahead and take it the easy way and not struggle and fight against my block. Even if I were using a light colored fabric, I would still go ahead and do this. You may get a little shadowing in it, but it's up to you. You can go either way, But I find it's easier to just press this and have that little extra bit of shadowing than to put the double the seam allowances. Because not only do I have to press this over, but now I have this seam allowance and the blue and the black, and now I'm going to have to quilt over it also. But this way I just have everything just laying nice. When I press it over to the single fabric like this, everything lays flat. It's not as thick of a bump to go over when I'm quilting. And after it's pressed, the only thing left to do is to go ahead and trim it up. Now you're going to trim these to whatever size you're using. Now as I'm looking at this, my square is actually 6 inches. I could trim them all to 6 inches, but I had a couple and when I was doing the quilt that were just under 6 a little bit. So I went ahead and just trimmed everyone down to 5.5 inches. And that way I knew I could use all of my blocks and not have to worry about it. I used to have a problem before I started using the new sewing machine that had an actual 1/4 inch where my needle moved over to the 1/4 inch mark and I had a 1/4 inch foot. I always struggled getting my seams just perfectly. So if you're getting your seams all exactly right and all of your blocks are coming out at 6 inches, then just go ahead and trim them up to that size, unless you've already figured your quilt at 5.5 inches. I mentioned that you need to add and make your blocks an inch bigger than what you want your final blocks to be. I remember reading online many years ago that that was the formula you used. And then after everything's pressed, I would just go ahead and I would take my rotary cutter and my ruler and I would just go ahead and trim everything down to the size that I'm going for. I'm going to go ahead and put a link up in the iCard to a video where I showed you how to trim down your half square triangles. Sometimes you might only have to trim off the little dog ears or just a little bit of a sliver, and depending on how some of your blocks might get, maybe they shifted a little when you were stitching, your stitching lines weren't quite right, then you might have to trim off a little bit extra. So that's it. They look really nice and complicated when you put them in your quilts, but making string blocks and half square triangles, they're really easy to do. And to get it into this zigzag pattern, all I did is I alternated and I had 2 V's of my string block, and then when I went down to the next section I would have 2 more. So you just, on this way you end up with the pyramids going up with your string blocks, and down here you have these little pyramids or your V's going down. Once you just start laying it out, it'll be really easy to see with your eye. If you start putting together and you get something like this, then you know you don't have it quite right. So your blocks are either going to look like this or they're going to look like that. Now right now I have 6 across, so that's an even number, but I am going to be adding these down the side, so I will end up with an odd number, and I don't think it really matters. To me, I don't mind how it looks, which way it ends at. Mine are going to end up looking like this, so one way or another I have this going down or I have it going up. Either way it's going to end in one direction or the other. I kind of like the way it goes down like this, but then at the beginning you have it as it starts at the top. So it doesn't really matter how many you put in. When I did it with an even number, I have it starting going at the top going down, and I have it ending going up. So each row is going to alternate. I have it finishing off. I have the last zigzag is a colored area, and my first zigzag is a black one. So it all depends on how you want it to look. Add or subtract rows or columns as needed to get the way you want your quilt to look. So I hope that helped everyone out who had any questions on how I made these half square triangles using the string blocks. If you have any more questions, please go ahead and leave them down below in the comments, and I will help you out. And if I need to make another video to show you anything else, I'll go ahead and do that. Unless you guys have any other questions, this is going to end the series on the string blocks. I showed you a couple different ways on how you can use them. There's still many more. As I mentioned before, you can go on Pinterest and look up different ideas for using string blocks. There's a lot of fun and crazy ways to do them. I'm just doing the little baby quilts and I'm not planning anything, so I was just doing the scrappy version. So I really like the way this came out, and I like the ones where everything lined up just like this. I really enjoy the way these look too, so I'm going to be making some more baby quilts like this. And as I showed earlier, you can also have it this way with going down lines that way. There's many different ways. You can go ahead and make some mock-ups after you get yours all done. Put them up on your design wall and just switch things around until you find something that looks good for you. And then remember, take a picture of it so that once you take it off your design wall and start sewing it, you won't get confused and mix up any of the rows. So thanks for hanging out with me in the craft room while I explored some more string block options. I know I'm going to be making many more because it's a great way for me to use up my scraps. I find it really relaxing. Now some of you have found out there's a little secret. When you shut your craft room door at the end of the night after working on your string blocks, your scraps just seem to multiply now, don't they? So what happens is when you're starting to put your scraps in containers and we start digging through them, they get fluffed up. So it's that little fluff monster that makes it look like you have more scraps than you started with. What I found this time around is I used to do that process. Just grab my scraps, cut off a piece with some scissors or rotary cutter, stitch it down, and off I went. This time I took one of my plastic shoe boxes. I cut all my strips ahead of time and I put them all into the bucket. I had thin ones, thick ones. I could separate the longer ones in one container and shorter ones in another, however it works for you. And I found that I was actually emptying my containers that way. So as I was using up my strips, of course, the little container is going to get emptied because it's just a small little shoebox. And then I go and I fill it up with more scraps. So then it felt like I was actually accomplishing something. So my stack of scraps was actually going down instead of multiplying in the dark like bunny rabbits. So if you're getting discouraged because your scraps just seem to get bigger and bigger and bigger, maybe you might want to try that technique. Just throw them in. Take a small amount that are already cut up, put it in a small container, and that way you can see how it's emptying out as you're going. Because we know you're using your scraps because you have 100 or 200 of your string blocks all made. So we know you've used them. You're not creating more, you just still have more left to use. So that's it for me. Please remember to like, subscribe, and ring that little bell if you'd like YouTube to let you know what's going on. If you're interested, pop on over to my Patreon page. The link is down below. And we're having more conversations about different blocks and fabrics. And there's other videos and stuff for you to watch over there. If you're looking for me anywhere else on the internet, on Facebook, if you're looking for my email, Instagram, anything like that, my blog, everything's down in the description box underneath the videos. Sometimes you have to hit that little arrow or you have to click see more, read more, show me more, depending on what device you're on. And then there'll be a box down below where I list all that types of information. And if you have any friends who might be interested in working through their scraps with us, please go ahead and use that little share button down there. Invite them on over and they can join us in using up their scraps. So that's it until next week. I'm not 100% sure of what we're going to be doing next week, so it's going to be a surprise for both of us. But I do have a few ideas in mind that you guys might be interested in. So until next time, I'll see you later. Bye!